faculty members, guests from abroad, and particularly fellow panelists. It's been a very interesting day so far. For those of you who heard the inaugural session, I'm sure you'll be inspired by the topic we're discussing today. Professor Westerlin said this morning that he hated to speak about the future, particularly about the UN, and has resisted that in many other occasions. But now we are turning our eyes back to assess the UN, and we have with us people from various, disciplines to do that. The format will be as follows. I will be asking each of our panelists 4 questions. I will first ask them to identify 2 successes of the UN in its past. Secondly, I'll ask them to indicate 2 failures of the UN in the past. And then I'll ask them, third and fourthly, to explain this, both how they feel this, the success and the failure. And then finally, a kind of a theoretical question, which when often posed, by the way, in final exams, could you envisage the UN being established today with the circumstances facing us now, rather than those which faced us in 1945? But I'll also ask the panelists to give us a short introduction before they answer the first question about how they came to the UN, or in those of us who have been employed there or working in various places and otherwise. And I will begin. I'll begin by answering the first 2 questions. First of all, in my view, the 2 major successes of the UN are the Law of the Sea Convention, my students won't be surprised, and the International Criminal Court. Again, my students won't be surprised. I'm happy to teach both of these subjects here at Jindal. How did I come to the UN? Just over 50 years ago, I walked into the delegates' lounge in the UN building in New York, and with awe as a young university student. And that awe remains to this day, despite having been in that delegates' lounge thousands of times over the past 50 years. I came then as an employee of the UN, working in the Office of the Secretary General. I represented my government in the UN for decades at various conferences. Became an expert to the Human Rights Commission. I was a member of the United Nations International Law Commission. I'm now became a judge in a tribunal which is affiliated to the UN, the election taking place in that very same building that I recall from 50 years ago. And throughout this time, I have not lost my appreciation, I can still say awe, at this organization. So this is a bit of a disclaimer. So you will not hear from me very critical comments. I always compare, what is going on to what could have been going on. But I also, when I was contemplating how I became a part of the UN, I remembered one of my mentors. I would begin by one of my mentors, Professor Raj Kumar mentioned this morning how it's very important to know how nations behave, not how they speak, but how they behave, which reminded me of the seminal work by one of my professors at Columbia, Do Henken, with exactly that title. But more importantly, it was Richard Gardner, Professor Richard Gardner, who introduced me to the UN, and I can frankly say, arranged for the job that I had first. He died last Friday at the age of 91. So I rather want to dedicate this to him with thanks for all the guidance he has given me over the years. Now, in one of the obituaries about him, again, we were talking this morning about you recall, the stalwarts that set up the UN. He was inspired as a young student by sessions he spent with Eleanor Roosevelt. It actually took place in Paris. And that inspired him to be a great proponent of the UN and human rights in general for the rest of his life, his long and successful life. But again, in one of these obituaries, it's pointed out that even as early as 1970, he identified one of the major causes, which is still prevailing today. He wrote, 1970, and I quote, "We are finally beginning to recognize that how a nation deals with its natural environment is no longer its own and nobody else's business. We are beginning to comprehend the unity of the world's ecological system, which means that all nations may be affected by how any one of them treats its air, water, and land." I end the quote. Shortly thereafter, he became involved in environment concerns in the United Nations. Well, which brings me to answer my second question. To me, the two major failures of the UN are, in fact, climate change, and then, of course, quite clearly, the Rwanda, failure of the UN in Rwanda. Now, I've told our panelists that we must always be distinguishing between the UN as an organization and the UN and its member states. Already this morning, we saw that great distinction between the UN as an organization, and by the way, not just a political organization in New York, but all over, and UNDP, as we know. And that, we must bear that in mind when we are assessing the UN. What of this is the UN? What of this is member states? And we heard very often this morning about the conflict, in fact, between the organization and its member states. Well, having made this introduction, I can now ask each of them to, first of all, say how they came to the UN, and then answer my first question, just in 2 words. What are the failures? Oh, sorry, what are the successes? What are the failures? And when they finished, I'm going to ask you, before we go into elaboration, I'm going to ask you to put your name, in a sense, or your hand, to these issues. So I want you to think yourselves, what are your 2 most important issues? And secondly, what are your 2 most important failures, both failures and successes? And then we'll, if you have some which have not been already raised, I'd like to hear about them before we carry on. Well, with this introduction, I ask you to begin. Thank you.
I'm very pleased to be here today. 2 reasons primarily. One, of course, the esteemed company that this puts me in, sitting along with many of the practitioners. And of course, the second, and I would confess the more important reason, is this room full of students who are starting their journey looking at international organizations and the United Nations in particular. So hopefully we will be able to generate anew that interest to look at the United Nations. How do I link up with the United Nations? From the outside. So I'm not a practitioner. I've not been inside the esteemed hallways other than in academic sort of linkages, but I teach the United Nations as well as the World Trade Organization. Let me just say I'm from the Jawaharlal Nehru University, the JNU, which is located in New Delhi. And this is one of the only universities where there is a specialized division that focuses only on the teaching of international organization. Theory of organization, and basically looking at international politics from the lens of organization. So I teach a full MA course on international organization and also one on organization and law, and that's how I'm engaged with the UN.
As to how I joined the United Nations, I was working in the Ford Foundation's office in New Delhi, and some of you may or may not know that the offices of the United Nations in New Delhi have been given rent-free to the UN by the Ford Foundation. So the whole set of buildings, which was built by a wonderful architect called Joseph Stein, belonged to the Ford Foundation. And the Ford Foundation decided to stop being an operational foundation and started only making grants, at which stage they didn't need a whole lot of experts and consultants and so on. So they gave away the main building to the United Nations. But for this historical fact, I did not know very much about the United Nations when I was working in the Ford Foundation, until the United Nations Development Program released its first Human Development Report in 1990. When I read that report, I was absolutely electrified. I thought this is a stunning document. It's revolutionary in terms of what it's attempting to do, defining a concept of human development and taking governments away from focusing on gross domestic product and economic growth alone, and to getting them to direct their attention to the well-being of people. So I thought this organization is where I want to go to. So the moment a vacancy appeared in the India office of the UNDP for the post of a senior economist, I applied, and luckily I got the job, and I just had to walk a few yards from my office to my new office. And I served the United Nations Development Program for 22 years after 1990.
Thanks, Gudmundur. It's a pleasure to be here today, especially because I'm in very august company. I must say that my association with the United Nations is a lot shorter than the ones that Gudmundur and Sudarshan have had, of course. I came into the United Nations first as an NYU fellow after I finished my master's. I was an assistant at the United Nations International Law Commission in Geneva, and that was my first attachment. It led to a position as a legal assistant at the International Law Commission, after which I had an opportunity to be a lawyer at the United Nations Assistance to the Khmer Rouge trials associated with the extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia in Phnom Penh. And I worked there on one case in the prosecution division. And after that, I haven't worked in prosecution anymore. I worked in chambers at the United Nations International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda in Arusha. And there I worked as a chambers lawyer, assisting the judges in preparing the judgments at the trial level for 2 of the last multi-accused cases of the ICTR. And that's the extent of my association as a lawyer within the United Nations system. I feel like the questions that Gudmundur had set for us gave me an opportunity to reflect on not just what I consider successes and failures of the organization, but also an opportunity for me to present to students at our university aspects of the organizations that they may not otherwise know. But my fellow panelists haven't yet responded to the question on successes and failures, so I'll hand it to Mohan.
Thank you very much, Gudmundur. It's a pleasure to be here. As with most things that have happened in my life, my association with UN and then WTO both happened by accident, not by design. Also because God and Ministry of External Affairs move in very mysterious ways. Ambassador Neelam Sabharwal is here, my senior colleague, and she will agree with me as well. And the reason I say it is because based on your rank, you are asked to choose a foreign language other than English. Presumably you know English when you join the Foreign Service. It can be increasingly contested these days, but nevertheless we will assume that everybody knows English when they join. So I opted for French, and I was desperate to go to Paris. I should have known better. Because I wanted to go to Paris, the ministry said, no, go to Geneva and learn the French language and also do a bit of UN. And then the second time round, I was so keen to go to New York, because for a typical Foreign Service officer in the Indian Foreign Service, New York, Gudmundur is the Mecca. If you haven't done New York, although Ambassador Neelam Sabharwal belongs in my category, we did a lot of Geneva together. So since I asked for Paris, the External Affairs Ministry, in its infinite wisdom, everywhere, all the ministries of External Affairs are the same. You know, if you know Russian, they will send you to France. If you know French, they will send you to China, that kind of thing. So they said, no, 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 you can't go to New York. We will send you to Geneva to do something called GATT. So GATT and then WTO. But I must say, in retrospect, that I'm very grateful to the ministry for having done what they did. Because I think there is absolutely wonderful to start your innings at the Human Rights Commission, as it was called then, in Geneva, where I felt that if India wanted to vote on an issue, my rule of thumb is look at the United States and do the opposite. We were always fine. I don't think I ever considered, I mean, this is really a brutal kind of statement and a confession on the Human Rights Commission. Never really considered the human rights aspect of any issue. And that's what happens if you allow states to deal with the subject exclusively. Because we do it on the basis of real politics. We don't do it on the basis of anything else. This is my brief, so I vote according to the brief. I don't think I ever stopped to consider what was the situation in East Timor. East Timor was a big deal those days, you know, with Indonesia still hanging on and the rest of it. So I think this is probably a bad introduction. I think you guys should be idealistic and you listen to Ramin and exactly, Shiv Vishwanathan. I think they are fine. You shouldn't lose it too early in life. There will come a point when you will think, when you are absolutely convinced they were talking a load of rubbish, but you are not there yet. So I think you should continue to have this idealism until you are 40 or so. So thank you very much, Gudmundur. I'll wait for others to respond to your question and then take it from there.
My sort of understanding, I'm not going to be looking at issue areas, the way in which you identified, you know, the law of the seas, etc., and climate change, but more in general. And in terms of achievement, I want to first point to achievement not just in sense of what the organization does, but also in the sense of what the organization is. So the governance function vis-a-vis the concert function. And I think this is very little, you know, it isn't talked about enough, it is underemphasized, but it is something which we need to get back to in terms of achievement. A second sort of issue area achievement is how the United Nations has converted from an interstate forum looking specifically at issues of peace and security to a more human organization looking at, in its own words, people, planet, and prosperity. And I'm borrowing from the Agenda 2030. Within which I would like to bullet point the issues of environment and the issues of human rights and development. Now, I understand that you pointed at climate change as a failure, but I'm looking at environment in a broader way and I'm positing it within the achievements. As far as failures are concerned, very briefly, one of the singular failures of the United Nations is, of course, its own reform. And perhaps the fact that it has remained outdated in the context of the changing international system. And the second is the more, coming from the critical theory, the instances when the organization has given up to the power politics and the diktats of the member states, thereby leading to suboptimal outcomes. So for me, these are the two failures.
I think on the success, the first one I alluded to, which persuaded me to leave Ford Foundation and join the UN, was the Human Development Report. And so I think we generally tend to, and economists are particularly guilty of that, of setting goals and targets and then seeing has it been achieved within some time frame. And neglecting the importance of ideas and the transformative capacity of those ideas. So in that respect, the conceptualization of development as both something that improves the well-being of people as well as freedom. Amartya Sen, who worked with Mahbub-ul Haq and articulated the concept of human development, titled his book, Development as Freedom. This is to counter a misconception that was around for some time, that you needed a bout of dictatorship and discipline in order to achieve a certain development standard. And therefore, development was posited against democracy and freedoms as making things messy and making decisions difficult. And so look at some of these countries that made rapid strides. So the idea of human development is that human development incorporates human freedoms. And this is often lost sight of. So in the realm of ideas, this is wonderful. But if you want to look at some other achievements of the UN, I'd say, the eradication of smallpox. If you think about it, that was achieved in 1977 in a period of about 10 years. The enormity of that challenge is phenomenal. And I'd invite all of you to watch a video that's there on YouTube by a man called Larry Brilliant, who at the time he does the video was the president of the Google Foundation. And he describes the last phase of the eradication of smallpox, which is in India. He was in an ashram in Mathura, working as a doctor with his wife, and the head of the ashram told him, the WHO is working hard to eradicate smallpox. You've done enough for the ashram, now go and work for the WHO and try and make it achieve its goal. And he describes the challenges that you had when many people in this country believed that smallpox is the wrath of the goddess, and that the goddess would be even more angry if you announced the fact that a child had been affected by smallpox, so therefore you had to conceal it and not tell anybody, and then just depend on faith and worship towards the goddess for the child to survive. That was a widespread mentality in this country. To overcome that and to find out every instance and case of smallpox and deal with it and completely eradicate that disease is a phenomenal achievement. Those are the two achievements, I'd say. One which is quantifiable, you set yourself a 10-year goal, you achieved the target within that 10-year goal, and it's an enormously complex target. So these two, I'd say, are achievements. You could also add other things like decolonization. In 85 years, 85 countries became free as a part of the United Nations' commitment, the Charter's commitment to decolonization. And that's, a significant achievement. And even though now there are one or two dependencies in the world that are left in the Pacific Islands, most countries are free and no longer colonies. As to failures, see, it's interesting whether you want to count the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank and the IMF as part of the UN or not. They don't consider themselves part of the UN, but technically they report to ECOSOC. And technically they have the same privileges as the United Nations. And the UN too, has gone along with the goal of increasing the rate of growth of developing countries, which is a goal that was singularly not achieved. It's happening more recently now, thanks to the growth of China and India. The world average of developing countries has been pulled up. But for the first development decade and the second development decade, this particular goal of reducing poverty and at the same time increasing rate of growth was a bit of a failure. The other one I'd say, and you made the distinction between member countries of the UN and the UN itself. And one enormous failure speaks to the failure of the member states. They voted in the General Assembly in 1970 that they would contribute 0.7% of their GDP as a voluntary contribution to the work of the United Nations. And to this day, that goal has not been achieved. I mean, about 4 Scandinavian countries have met or slightly exceeded that goal. Ireland wanted to do it for 1%. But most countries are way, way below. 0.2% is about what the United States does. And so this, in a way, points to when you are assessing failure and success and goals, and you must also look at what are the goals that you've set yourself and what were the means given to you to achieve those goals. And on the means side, the United Nations as an organization has been badly let down by its member states.
I'm going to stick to the brief and not tell you why. but I'm going to tell you what I think are two significant achievements of the United Nations in the past. One is the International Law Commission. Creation of the International Law Commission under Article 13 and the work that it does on codification and progressive development. You can tell me later whether you agree or not. And the second achievement, I think, is the Program of Assistance, which is a program run by the Codification Division under the Office of Legal Affairs. And it's the Program of Assistance that works with UNITAR, which is the United Nations Institute for Teaching and Research. And they are also the body that work on a program called Teaching, Research, and Wider Appreciation of International Law, under which they run about 61 programs. I was Googling this yesterday, that benefit lawyers and students from developing countries to access resources and experts working within the United Nations system and other multilateral institution systems to learn about the work of these organizations. And the failures, I had a long list, but my colleagues have mentioned some of them. I'll just repeat one because Gudmundur said it already. The big failure, I think, is the Framework Convention, the UNFCCC on climate change. And I definitely would be interested in discussing this with my colleagues. The Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC. And the second failure is the International Court of Justice. Be curious to hear what you think about why I list it as a failure. But I really do believe that the method of settling disputes and a conscious move away from arbitration, a conscious move to contentious dispute settlement between states has not worked out. But maybe I'm just provoking you, and I don't really think that. We don't know. I would like to list one more, just in case anyone doesn't want to discuss either of these, which is several courts that were born for international criminal law, the tribunal system. And I put that as a whole. I put within it also the hybrid tribunals with UN assistance and the specialized tribunals, and the two which are purely UN tribunals. But there are 6 in this group, and I think that they also merit a good.
So it's interesting because, no, that's fine. It's logical as well. No, it's interesting because what may be considered failure by some people can be considered success. And I would like to begin by saying I actually think the Paris Accords on climate change were the best possible outcome in the circumstances. And so as a pragmatic diplomat or a pragmatic ex-diplomat, I certainly think that was a wonderful achievement, actually. I don't think anything else was possible. But if you ask me, stark failures and stark kind of success, we'll begin with success. For me, intervention in Iraq is one thing, Kuwait is another. These have got oil, they've got resources. I would, take you back to countries which otherwise slips under the radar. So Haiti, Sierra Leone. For me, those are the countries where nobody bothers to remember what is happening in terms of human suffering. And I think the UN has done a wonderful job in those countries and actually brought some of them back to stability. So that's one. The second success for me, more recent, which gives me hope, is the Sustainable Development Goals. I thought it was fantastic the way they did it. I happened to talk to an Indian negotiator, a young Indian negotiator who took active part in it. It was a completely open-ended working group. It was bottoms up. It was not a top-down thing like the MDGs. MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, were just thrust on countries by the OECD. This was more an exercise in which the developing and the least developed countries participated in a manner never seen before in the UN. That's my honest assessment. 2 failures, Rwanda, Srebrenica has to be at the top of the list. But the 2 other failures, for me, one we will be talking about it in my session when we talk of UN reform. Some organizations of the UN don't deserve to exist. I'm going to be harsh. UNIDO, for example. I mean, there has been frequent talk that UNIDO should be wound up. I cannot imagine why the damn thing still exists. And that gives a very, very wrong impression, reinforces prejudice of people against the UN as a wasteful bureaucracy where you have people getting thousands of dollars a salary, doing pretty much nothing. All the negative stereotypes, of course, wrong. We know UN has got some fine people and they work. But like any other bureaucracy, so the inability to cut back, and I think you can accuse the UN of overextension. You know, they've just gone off into areas which, you know, they shouldn't be really concerned about. So that's one thing. The second failure, I would say, is the unfortunate inability of the UN Security Council to just get stuck in this post-Second War II kind of situation where nobody believes these countries represent the power structure anymore. It will become even more of a joke when India actually surpasses UK and France in economic terms. Even nominal GDP, we will be there very soon. And then it will make complete nonsense of the existing membership, permanent membership of the Security Council. Thank you.
Talking about the responsibility to protect.
That the idea itself was a huge change in mindset and, the global political environment.
Yeah, please. Rocky now, successes.
Right. Another very important success that not too many people regard it to be is the very fact that the question of Palestinian statehood was addressed. The question of Palestinian statehood was addressed, which talks a lot about sovereignty and also takes into consideration the fact that even if you have a lot of influence in the Security Council, things may not go your way if you're rubbing countries off the wrong way.
Where around 8,000 Muslim men and women were massacred. So I think these are two failures according to me.
Regarding Russian invasion in Crimea, UN did not do much about it and Russia did whatever it wanted to. And the other one is regarding law as well. When we talk about international law relations, it did not do much as we are confused as we were before. Like,
I'm sorry, I didn't understand you.
it did not provide any kind of consistency or some law, something that we could hold it as a baseline or something like that. We were confused before UN and we are confused still regarding international relations as well as law.
The membership of the countries in UN. I think veto power is one of the failures of UN. Because out of 15 permanent members, if 5 have the power, veto power, and if all the countries agree to one resolution to be passed and that one country does not, then that resolution does not pass. One of the issues that is really close to my heart right now is Masood Azhar being declared as an international terrorist, which is being stopped by China. So, veto power is one of the failures I think UN has.
One of the really great successes of UN in the 90s was the Montreal Protocol with respect to depleting of the ozone layer. I feel that if that kind of coherence and cooperation can come between nations again, it would be hailed a great success for the environment.
Yeah, and right here, final two. Anyone else?
One success of the UN would be getting all member states to participate in the first place. It's very difficult to get different nation states with different policies and different perspectives in the same room to discuss issues which are very prominent in society. But then again, that comes with a demerit, which is a bias in consideration of issues, because there you have different nations with different agendas and different amounts of powers who wish to extend and show their power within the United Nations framework, and this can be seen in the selection of issues. Certain times when more powerful or developed nations take part in acts which are unfair, they're not recognized, whereas if it's done by nations who oppose these powerful countries, it is recognized.
One final one, please.
Yeah, two failures, in fact. If we're going to be case specific, so be it. The first thing is the very fact that there is a lot of difference between law and implementation on grounds of documents like the UNCLOS, considering how you can be a signatory and then there's a ratification phase that gives you the leeway. There's the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and even the existence of organizations, much like Professor Mohan Kumar said, the CTBTO, technically it's been outdone multiple number of times, and obviously the IAEA. So again, they need to understand and prioritize on which organization has a say over what. Now this, I think a second sort of failure in the UN's functioning, I would say, is the fact that the United Nations General Assembly resolutions 47, 48 called for a plebiscite in Kashmir, which has not been even exercised till date. Of course, not judging by the long and short of it, this just talks about how the United Nations has not been one of the best negotiators between parties to dispute, like Pakistan and India.
Final background, please.
So recent times is the post-war reconstruction which the UN has as its procedures to follow in certain countries which are going through conflict. So I feel that the work which UN did in countries like Sierra Leone, as Professor Mohan mentioned as well, and in countries like Afghanistan as well, is something which needs to be applauded a lot of times, considering it's lives of like thousands of people on lives of thousands of people at stake, and like they've really pulled it off again and again.
Well, thank you for your contributions. The idea of dialogue. Dialogue is good. That in dialogue, there's no place where there's more dialogue than in the UN. Two very specific complaints, shall we say, Kashmir and so forth. But I liked actually, as also Ambassador Professor Kumar referred to the unseen successes. Of course, our problem in the world today is that we only see the ones that attract, that they dwarf these in many ways. Now, I would like to skip the third question, not to say why, because we kind of dealt with that, about why you think these things are successes, because I think we've exposed that. What I want to ask you, we'll start with the panel, those failures that you identified, do you think they could have been averted? Was there a better way to do it? We heard this morning, and you were here for the reform discussion. We had a long discussion about the possibilities of reform, and do you think there's any chance of reform to mention yourself?
That the UN has seen. One of you mentioned, for example, the veto, but perhaps some of you already know this, but not only is there a veto, there is also something called the double veto, which locks in your veto power. So it is extremely difficult in that sense to then undo the institutional structures that exist. So, I mean, in other words, the veto applies only to substantive issues, not to procedural issues in the Security Council. But in order to decide whether an issue is substantive or procedural, you still need to go through a veto. That itself is, a veto applies to that. So I have very little hope as far as reform is concerned if we are looking at Security Council reforms. Of course, UN reforms is a very, very broad area. We tend to focus more on the legalistic side of reform, which can only go through charter reforms, focus more on the institutional structures, but there are also a whole lot of procedural administrative reforms which go on an everyday basis. So yes, I mean, I agree that we have to have a comprehensive viewing if we are going to be assessing the United Nations. On the Security Council, I see very little going forward as far as reform is concerned. I just want to point out, when this term was coined, United Nations, and when it was applied to this organization, one UN historian had pointed out this contradiction in the language that was used in the charter, where you say the United Nations are determined to unite. So he's saying, so are you united or are you determined to unite? Where exactly? And then he justifies it. This is Eugene Nicholas, and he justifies it by saying that some vision of the ends can inhere in the name of the organization. And yet, a month ago, I mean, a few months ago, at the 73rd General Assembly, we had the UN Secretary General talking about a severe trust deficit, etc., etc. So there is a situation of disunity, disaffection with the United Nations after so many years of its existence. So one of the principal reasons, in my mind, to my mind, is this whole notion of reform. Just two or three things. There are certain reasons why at this point the turning points need to be addressed. I mean, there are new power equations. We need to recognize that. There is a new sort of state-market relationship. There are changes in that. There are new technologies. And all of this, and there are also new issues. There are development concerns which we haven't seen before, which require universal solutions. So in the light of all of those, if the reforms are not going forward, there is a bleak future as far as faith in the United Nations is concerned.
Well, I mean, the failures I mentioned, I partly attributed to the Bretton Woods institutions, which is the World Bank and the IMF have always had the goals of macroeconomic stability and poverty reduction since they got into business. And in terms of those goals, there hasn't been success. But I think that may change thanks to the fact that the bank is no longer committed to the Washington Consensus and a neoliberal future. And has, in fact, named a department within the bank as the Human Development Department of the World Bank, which shows the power of ideas emanating from New York and the UN to Washington, D.C. So there's hope that that failure can be addressed in terms of paying more attention to a change in ideas as to, do you want the economy to do well, or do you want people to do well? And what are you going to fix your policies about? So there's hope there. The other failure I mentioned is charging the United Nations with the responsibilities and asking it to do so many things and not giving it the resources to do it, which is the 0.7% commitment. Again, that's easily rectified, but what comes in the way of that rectification is what you just mentioned, which is this trust deficit. I think the UN on the whole has been a very poor communicator of what it actually does. One of the human development reports, Mahbub al-Haq pointed out that if you took the operations of the United Nations across the other side of First Avenue, which means not the development programs, WFP, leave them out. They are involved, the Secretariat of the UN and bodies that come directly under the Secretariat of the UN. The budget of the United Nations annually is less than the combined budget of New York City's fire and police departments. Now, so you got to get a sense of proportion when you judge success and failure as to where the means, what ends, and what was needed. So, but I think these failures can be rectified, but provided we do something to restore what is the confidence in this institution, because there's been a sustained campaign to undermine the credibility and the standing of the United Nations for various reasons, for various and so that's necessary, and also the responsibility of member states. I mean, the United Nations managed to get every country to sign up except one to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, to get CEDAW adopted. Now, once it is adopted, CEDAW played a big part in our country. We didn't have a law against domestic violence, but the Supreme Court said, since you are a party to CEDAW, and CEDAW requires that you have to have institutional mechanisms for complaints of sexual harassment, you jolly well set it up. So that's the way in which ideas and influences permeate. So not everything can be done by the UN alone, But the fact that you've got these agreements, these conventions, the fact that you've got an agreement that the human rights are not to be divided into economic, social, and civil and political, and that they are one set of indivisible human rights agreed in 1991 by all countries in Vienna, that's an achievement.
However, eventually led to something. They were hooks on which things could be hung. We needed to come around to that. The process is as important as the result. For instance, you would find, having set up these mechanisms, office in some works on that, and they have to implement it. And we did it through protocols in the environmental area. So I think I look forward to hearing you saying what could have been done differently about the criminal code.
I was just provoking, actually. I was just trying to provoke a response from the audience and from my fellow panelists. I worked at the International Criminal Tribunals, and I think that you said very specifically that we have to separate the politics of the member states from the work of the institution. That's really hard to do. It's hard to assess the work of the institution without taking into account that the reason it can't work is often the democratic deficit created by a lack of trust by the member states. So it's a very artificial distinction to have to distinguish the two. Having said that, I thought that it was the democratic deficit that stopped the International Criminal Tribunals from being more, doing more, being set up, well, with more jurisdiction. So they were crippled to begin with. The ones that I've worked at, they worked under extraordinary conditions of stress because for the Rwanda Tribunal, it was a question about, I mean, the most basic question about where to set up the tribunal was something that they just couldn't agree upon. The state in which the genocide took place had no interest in participating at that point in the creation of a tribunal. And then eventually now, today the state raises questions about who owns history. So there's a new legitimacy threat to the tribunal, having worked on the Rwandan genocide for 25 years. It now has to answer to whom does the material that it has collected belong? Is it taking away the Rwandan people's history from them? Is there a sense of loss of ownership of their history, no matter how painful? To whom does it belong? So, at the time of the creation of this tribunal, it was created with a profound sense of apology to the international community. It was the best that the United Nations could do at the time, having failed to respond to the cries for help in Rwanda. This is in shaking hands with the devil, we all know. Gudmundur brought this up. Mohan Kumar has brought this up. They talk about Srebrenica, they talk about the failure of the United Nations to intervene. At the same time, there was a colleague here who brought up the ugly side of intervention. What happens when peacekeeping missions go rogue? And we have seen in Darfur cases of the United Nations peacekeepers joining the Janjaweed, which is the militia armed on horseback who commit brutality and crimes like rape in the countryside. And so who takes responsibility for that? Who takes responsibility for the Haitian cholera, even though somebody said that Haiti is an example of a success? So, I mean, I think that these are absolutes, words like successes and failure, and it doesn't seem very mature to use either one of them to describe any of the events that we've spoken about. The reason I put the Framework Convention on Climate Change is also, it's a difficult reason. The reason is also about the member states, the lack of cooperation of the member states. So it's impossible to blame the institution because in a way this is a success of the institution, as you said, to bring states to the negotiating table. In my trade law class last week, we were talking about, well, the World Trade Organization is the table. What do you expect the table to do? People sit around the table. And so it was a quip and wasn't very funny, but I think it makes the point that I'm trying to arrive at, which is that there is certainly something to be said about an organization that has stopped us from, I mean, we haven't had a nuclear war yet, and there's definitely something to be said about that, and that's what it was made for. So, I mean, what I mean is that I don't have the kind of pessimism, I don't share a sense of pessimism about possible reforms in the United Nations, and I feel strongly that it's a lack of resources, leadership, personality taking over in these offices. I mean, look at the Tribunal for the Law of the Sea. Today it's up there with all the other specialized tribunals of the United Nations. But for the first 15 years of its life as a law student, I remember studying it with a great sense of foreboding. What is this tribunal going to do? What is it going to rest the jurisdiction of the ICJ on delimitation? And it proved, to me at least, as an outsider, in the Myanmar-Bangladesh case is when we saw that the tribunal is handling delimitation issues with much more seriousness and science than we had seen from the International Court of Justice. And from then, I think states just have more faith in that system. So it's a combination of the institutional capacity, the membership of the institution, who are the judges on these tribunals. We have one of the judges sitting here with us, so I really can't say anything about it. But, you know, it's personalities and people and leaders that make institutions. So, yeah, it's not a very...
Very briefly, Gudmundur, I think everything has been covered by my co-panelists. I would say that the biggest reasons for failure, in my assessment, is big power politics and veto. There is a fair bit of bureaucracy that I would add to the second one. I mean, I became familiar with UN bureaucracy. I thought our bureaucracy, national bureaucracies, were the worst. You'll have to see the UN bureaucracy to believe that something can be far worse than that. It is multiplied by the governments involved, and recruitment is politicized, postings are politicized, everything is politicized. In fact, I have much greater respect for my bureaucracy after I became familiar with UN bureaucracy, but that's just an observation. So big power politics, veto, and bureaucracy. As for my assessment of where we go from here, UN is, I personally think the UN faces a fork in the road, actually. And I strongly believe G20 has taken away much of the work that the UN should have been doing. And the UN has lost its relevance considerably. The G20 has grown from just an economic grouping, and now they deal with financial action for dealing with terrorism. They've started looking at climate change very seriously. They've started looking at WTO. The Osaka summit is going to deal with electronic commerce because Abe says, I'm committed to electronic commerce. So I think the danger for UN and WTO, actually the danger for UN, they should just be looking at WTO, what happens to it. And what is happening to WTO is very interesting. That's an organization that I know inside out, so I'm capable of talking a little bit more confidently about that than I can for the UN. What the WTO has done is they've junked all the sacred principles of consensus, MFN, single undertaking, everything has been junked. And they've just gone completely plurilateral. They say, if you don't want to be part of e-commerce, too bad. We will go ahead and do it. That's what they're saying to India. Now that China 2 weeks ago has said we will join e-commerce. So I think this is what will happen to the UN. It will start by being a coalition of the willing, and then others will take over. So I've been saying this for some time, but the UN Security Council in particular should watch out. It will really reduce itself to laughable irrelevance if it does not do something. It'll be a joke, frankly, because nobody will give a damn about the decisions being made there. What difference does it make if the most important countries are outside? You really expect Japan, Germany, India, Brazil to take it seriously? What comes out of UNSC? First of all, nothing will come out, because I think the responsibility to protect was done with wonderful intentions, but I think what happened in Libya was a disaster. You exceeded the mandate, which was to protect the population, Benghazi and the rest of it, and you went on to say, we don't want Gaddafi. That was never part of the original resolution. You really cannot blame Russia and China now for vetoing every single intervention, because they say, look, listen what happened in Libya, that's haunting us. So I think the trust is badly broken. So the reasons why some of the success stories, and I'll finish there, smallpox was very much on my list, but also SDGs, no big power politics, no veto. So you take the issues with the least common denominator, UN will do bloody well. Because there is no veto, there is no big power politics, do very well. You know, you go around saying, I want to do microfinance, it's motherhood and apple pie, nobody's going to object to it. So you could become an organization like that. That could be the future of UN actually. The UNSC can do what it damn well pleases, nobody really is going to bother too much about it, but if you want to do smallpox, if you want to do SDGs, if you want to do microfinance, if you want to do gender equality, with due respect, go ahead, make my day. It's good. Nobody else is doing it. Please do it. And we will agree. But the moment you say, no, we want to do something in Afghanistan, Iraq, then you have just big power politics. So I think that's the way I see it. A little pessimistic, but then we'll wait for the next session where we're going to be talking about reform of the UN as well. Thank you.
I'll add to you, I just want to follow up on one, maybe two of the points you mentioned. It is not an expensive organization. You mentioned even UNIDO, we could live with that. It's not going to kill anybody. I used to compare the budget of the UN with the price of a so-called Scud missile. Remember, they were quite common 15 years ago. It's a peanuts, even with all this inefficiency and so forth that you described, the bureaucracy and so forth. Well, I mean, having been one of those bureaucrats, there's a lot of good people, and even if it's only 10% effective, you know, the old joke, you know? The joke is that you come to in front of the UN building, and they say, how many people work here? And they say 20%. Even that's fine, it's so cheap, you know? 20% of a very small amount, and that's 20% is doing good things all across the board, including in security, and so forth, and all these, that's one thing I want to add. First, but secondly, none of us have actually mentioned the day-to-day work of the Geneva organizations, which make communications possible, which deal with world health and these kinds of things, steadily working through, even with some political aspects. They are working very hard for us, and G20 could not do that. They don't have the capacity to do that. And then if something happens when there's some unification amongst the Security Council, perhaps. Well, I just have a very sad, in a sense, a sad story in response to the question about the dialogue. I joined the UN when I'm in my 20s, remained idealistic. And I was at a conference in Vienna, one of these law conferences, and there I was waxing eloquent about what a great organization this is. We sit down and we meet 100 and at the time 70 countries, discussing this and that. And dialogue is really important to understand each other's viewpoints. And there was a senior Yemeni diplomat, north or south. They remember they were divided. And he said, well, I don't know about this dialogue business. And my neighbors to the north, we know each other like the back of our hands, and we're still fighting, which shows us what's happening today. And then about 5 years later, I'm in the UN in Geneva, and the North and South had just united. And I see the same man. What are the chances? And I said to myself, look at this. See? Everything is possible. Ah, yes, they found oil on the border. And where we are in Yemen today. Please, would you join us?
Actually, it is very, very important title, The Future of the United Nations. But when one thinks of the future and the past, to assess the past, so there is a long span of time. Is it from the foundation of the United Nations, 1945, up till this moment? Well, definitely, there is ups and downs. There is success and there is big failures. Success could be in the decolonization, and the granting of independence to occupied countries. But the failures are a great many. As a matter of fact, the United Nations mechanism did not implement its main mandate of prevention of wars, of promoting of enough sustainable development away. The very fact that the 5 permanent members, and I wonder and always ask myself, why 5? Because if you take 4, the fist of power to strike is lacking. So with this 5 is I have a strong power and enough power to implement what I want, regardless of what other nations' interests. This has become very clear when we speak about the future of the United Nations. We have also to go back to what and why the League of Nations failed and what happened after. And the failure of the United Nations in its mandate will lead to a huge catastrophe. It seems that unless there is a quick, reasonable, rational reform of the United Nations system, and especially the veto power, that would lead to and lack of cooperation. And lack of cooperation will deepen the distrust between the member nations. As we could see, future is a danger. Maybe I am very pessimist, but what I see what's happening in the Middle East, what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan, what happened in Africa, what is happening now with this unipolar world system, hegemonic power, the clash of countries, it is not encouraging. That's why the future is more dangerous unless rationality, unless democracy. When, liberals and so on ask for democratic nations, etc., would there not be a necessity for democracy in international relations? Or only interests of nations or interest groups? Erdogan has called for demolishing the United Nations and thinking for a new, different system, which is too extreme as a matter of fact. And being Ottoman Empire having of that agreement, maybe some others are willing to do the same. So the United Nations, from its name, should be united for the nations, but for the peoples of the world of those nations. It is not for a specific. That's why I appreciate this real debate and dialogue, which is really making and inciting new thoughts for how to think for the better future and safer future of not only the United Nations, but the world, with the effective, dynamic United Nations, not what the Americans and the others say, I will go and send the military operations and continue in Iraq while voting on Resolution 1441, regardless of the opinion of the veto members. If such is the policy to follow, that would be very serious. Thank you.
Just on 2 points. One, I think Ambassador Kumar and others said about the failure of Rwanda. And I think it's indeed true, but I think we should also recognize that the United Nations has brought about a very successful outcome of peacekeeping and peace-building operations. And there are many. Cambodia, I was in Cote d'Ivoire, Namibia, and so on, Sierra Leone, and so forth. So I think we have to balance the failure and the success. And regarding the veto problems and the Security Council, I very much agree with the professor. Now, at the same time, without these veto powers in the United Nations might have repeated the failure of the League of Nations. If United States, Russia, or China leave United Nations, then United Nations will in fact have cannot function. And indeed now, more than ever, it's more universal, 192 countries inside. And it is designed such a way to keep major powers as a members of the United Nations. I think you're right, the failure in a way is, United Nations is not changing its structure as the world changes. In other words, UK and France may not be as powerful as it used to be. We can say that. So I think United Nations has to change to meet the changing requirements of the global society. And for that matter, as you rightly said, that, okay, let the UN go down and build a new one. Indeed, that's a possibility. When I was a professor, I used to, in a way, teach students. I don't know if you heard the same story, why international organizations are created. Why did member states create international organizations that controls you? Isn't that interesting? Nobody wants to create something to control you, but it's necessary. So that's a reason, and I think what Mr. Charest is saying is a peaceful way of constitutional reform that's mandated in Article 109. I think we should go for it. And I think India should be very much pushing for it. I tell you, as a Japanese, yes, Japan should be inside, but Japan's power, relative power, is much smaller. India is strong, you know. It's recognized by China and many other countries. And I think your government has to take it more seriously, not for the India to become a permanent member of the United Security Council as such, but we should go for the new structure. And India will be in any way. So India should demand for the change, constitutional change, as Dr. Charest recommends. Thank you.
Comments here, whether we could start anew and build up something else. Frankly, I thought one of the only way you could change the Security Council veto question is to start a new organization. Get one of the oil-rich countries to sponsor another organization. Else that wants to go over there in that organization goes there and leave the UN with the 5 permanent powers. But yes, I was hoping you could contribute to this because, of course, you've been there. We're segueing up into the next panel about the reform. I think we've done as much as we can in a very short time. Thank you very much, everyone, for that, in assessing the UN in the past. And we will leave then to you, Professor Kumar, to moderate the future. And I thank everyone for their contribution, particularly to the panels. Thank you very much.